All right, so yesterday we looked at what doctors don't know about you, and this morning we're going to look at what science doesn't know about you, and we want to. Okay, thanks. Yes, that's usually somebody else's responsibility to make me look presentable. Thanks, honey. And anyway, so it's a pleasure to be here with you, and it was a pleasure to spend yesterday evening with you as well. And what doctors don't know is the cause of disease, and what science doesn't know we're going to get to. You can imagine this would be a problem if you woke up one day and came out of your home and, well, you saw that. It's nice to have a nice home, but if your nice home does not have a good foundation, then however nice it might have been, that was a nice thought, it's just not going to end up nice. So in order for anything to work out well, we have to have a good foundation. We have to have a firm foundation. And so with anything, we want to have a good and a firm foundation. And so when we consider and we look at foundations, also with information, we need to have a foundation as well. And as we looked at yesterday, there is a fundamental law of all nature, and that law is that nothing exists or functions from itself, and nothing exists or functions for itself. That means that everything is dependent upon power, material, and resources outside of itself in order to function, if it functions, for it to exist, if it exists, and if it's a living thing, for it to live as well. And that nothing just keeps that to itself. Everything will use what it uses, and then it will pass it along. It will pass it along. And maybe this needs to be in the front and not the back for a connection standpoint. All right. So everything in creation takes in order to give. Right? Everything takes in order to give. And this is the law of life. And that law of life in the taking and the giving means that everything functions like a channel, or a hose, or a riverbed, or a whatever. You can look at it in a number of different ways. The trunk of a tree functions like a channel, right? It's going to be taking the nutrients that were passed on to it from the roots, and it's going to be bringing it up towards the branches. A branch serves as a channel from the trunk to the leaves, and the leaves serve as a channel from the branch to the air, and so on, and everything serves as a channel to everything else. And as a channel, everything has an entrance, and it has an exit, and the taking is at the entrance, and the giving is at the exit, and cause is at the beginning of the channel, and effect is at the end of the channel. And so there is always cause and effect. Now, that is true, and everything does take to give, and everything takes from one place, and then it gives in another place. Right? So nothing takes and gives at the same place. Nothing takes and gives at the same place. You don't take food and then give food at the same place. You don't take, you don't take water and give water at the same place, and so on. Unless something's, wrong, then you might regurgitate a few things from that standpoint. A hose only takes on one side, and then it gives on the other side. It doesn't do the taking and the giving in the same place. It would be pointless for it to take from the faucet and give to the faucet. Right? It must take from the faucet and then give somewhere else. And the riverbed takes from upstream and then gives downstream. It doesn't give right back where it took from, and so on. So nothing gives where it takes from. Of course, that particular picture is an interesting one because it's a location where there's so much wind that it takes the waterfall and throws it back up into the pool that is above the waterfall. But once the wind dies down, then that water's still going, and it will continue taking and giving. And so It's unidirectional, like you see in a river, in a wire, in a hose, and other things in nature. But while everything individually takes to give from one place to another place, something else will come and take from that and then give. And then something else will take from that and then give. And everything ultimately will end up in a circuit. It'll ultimately end up in a circuit. Like in electricity, electricity only works in a circuit. Your hydrological cycle with water, that ultimately ends up in a circuit. Sometimes the circuits can appear to be a bit complex. And your circulatory system, that ends up in a circuit as well. And every system, if you consider the system as a whole, functions in a circuit. And there must be an order to every function. Right? There must be an order to every function. And the order of function does not change. Right? The order of function does not change. And when the order is correct, the system is going to function the way that it's supposed to. And when the order is incorrect, now the system is going to dysfunction. And truth, what is truth? I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, but truth is essentially information that puts things in the right order so it works. Therefore, error is simply information that rearranges things in the wrong order so that it doesn't work. And so you can check whether something is truth or not based upon whether it works or whether it doesn't. Right? If it's truth, it will work. If it's not, it will not. And that, of course, begs the question, if your truth isn't working, is it truth? Right. Now, there are laws that govern the function of everything that happens, everything that functions, and laws are fixed. For example, the law of gravity, it is what it is. Now, what we understand it to be might change from time to time, but what it is itself is, it is, right? So there was the Newtonian idea of gravity, that it's kind of like almost the idea of two magnets, and the bigger the thing is, the more magnetic force it has, and it just attracts each other to themselves, you know. So you have a big Earth, that's a strong magnet. You have a little person, that's a little magnet, and then they attract each other to each other, right? And if you have two people, well, that's little magnets, and there's not a lot of attraction that's there until something else, some chemistry happens, and then there's a lot of attraction. But you get, yes, anyways. I'll let that settle in. And then who was it? It was Einstein came along, and Einstein said, well, no, it's not actually this magnetic force between two masses. It's actually mass warps time and time-space, and so it warps space. And so now that space is warped, now there's a movement in the direction. It's kind of like putting a bowling ball on a net or on a mesh, and then it kind of causes it to go down like that. And if you're within that kind of down action, then you're going to be drawn towards that thing and eventually get stuck to it. Right. Well, okay, whatever your idea of gravity is, it doesn't really matter. It's just, it still will function however you think it works. Right. Thermodynamics, well, it is what it is. And it's absolute. Our understanding of thermodynamics might change from time to time, but it doesn't change. Cause and effect, it is what it is. It's absolute. And our understanding, again, may change from time to time, but it doesn't change the law. Right? And so that's one important reason why we need to have law as the basis of evaluation and the basis of our understanding of things, because it's something that doesn't change. Right? Something that doesn't change. If, for example, you are used to going somewhere and you have landmarks, right? And you use landmarks to decide where you're going, what kind of landmarks do you want to choose and which ones do you not want to choose? Well, yeah. So if you go along and you're like, oh, that cow is right there, and after that cow, I need to turn left. And when I go down there, there's that particular sheep, and after that sheep, I need to turn right. And when I go down here, I see that there's this trash pile on the side of the road waiting to be picked up. And after that trash pile, then I'm going to turn in this direction. Well, you'll find out that in the future, you're not going to end up at the same place as you did before because all of your landmarks are movable, right? So if you want to get to the same place, again, well, you choose this house on this corner and that tree that's sitting there and so on as your landmarks. You want something that doesn't change in the process of understanding where you're going, or else you're in trouble. And we know that when it comes to getting to a location, but we don't know that very well when it comes to evaluating information. Because we actually use very changeable information in a process of evaluating information, and then we come to very interesting variable conclusions that are all over the place, right? All over the place. And so it is important for us to have unchanging things. So again, we mentioned that everything that functions is governed by law, and laws that govern function are unchangeable, right? They're fixed. And this means that now we can experiment. And now we can have predictability. Is it nice to be able to predict things? Yeah, it's nice, right? So the last 3,000 times that this airplane has flown, it flew. Well, it's nice to know that when you get on the airplane and you're about to go, right? And if this airline had the experience of the last 3,000 flights crashing, well, you would want to know that before you were going to go fly on, with that particular airline, because you might make a decision that, well, no, not going to fly with that airline today, right? So we can fly because there are laws that are predictable that we can evaluate, we can seek to understand, and now we can cooperate with, and so you can go on a flight. And you can explore space, and you can build submarines and explore very deep locations, and you can build batteries, and you can build robots, and all of this types of stuff, because laws are fixed. And because they're fixed, now we can look at the laws, we can seek to understand them, and now we can seek to work with them. Right? Now, we talked yesterday about some things about ourselves and about the mind, and that the mind is 9 times out of 10 the foundation of the issues that are going on in the body, because it's the main controller of what happens in the body. And when we think about the mind, well, the thoughts really are generated up in the cortex, the kind of outer layer that I've kind of tried to draw blue. And so that outer part, the cortex, is where you have the initiation of electrical activity, right? And then that electrical activity will result in signals being sent via the axons, and no, they're not that straight, but anyways, that's just the idea. And it will send that information to the central part of the brain, which we call the limbic system. And there will be a release of neurotransmitters, various different neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. And those will be picked up by other neurons, and then that information will be sent back. So there's the production of chemistry, and then a signal that's sent back to the cortex, where you then receive that information and then sense your feelings or emotions or so on. So your feelings, your emotions, are the result of chemistry. Right? It's a result of chemistry, and you can change how somebody feels by injecting them with chemicals. Right? So you can give somebody, for example, cocaine, and it will change how the individual feels. You can give somebody marijuana, and it will change how they feel. You can give them an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety medication, and it will change how they feel. So you can change how you feel based upon chemicals that you come into contact with, but you cannot change what you think by chemicals, right? So you can't inject somebody with a chemical that will make them to think altruistic, right? Or to be generous, or to be thoughtful, or to be considerate, or to be kind, or to, these different things. Now, since we are so used to thinking according to how we feel, then if you change the chemistry and you change how somebody feels, then oftentimes an individual will change how they think in relation to what they feel. And so that's sometimes the effect of like being on an antidepressant. The antidepressant makes you feel differently, and under that context of feeling differently, an individual will begin to think differently. But if you never learn how to think a certain way, despite how you feel, right? Because you don't have to feel a certain way to think a certain way. You don't. You don't have to be a slave to your feelings. And in fact, we shouldn't be. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy. But we have the privilege of not just thinking according to how we feel. And when we only change how we think in relation to how we feel, then what you'll find is that, let's say if you wanted to get off of the antidepressant and you start tapering it off and whatever, well, you'll find out that as you start feeling worse, you start thinking worse, right? You're feeling worse, and so now you start to think worse, and now you get right back into the same cycle. The individuals that can come off of the antidepressants and still do well is an individual who has learned to think a certain way despite how they feel. So that as the chemicals change, the individual continues to think in a particular way, in a good way, and now from that standpoint, it will control now the chemicals that are produced and eventually how you feel. Right? And it's in the cortex that we have, reason and judgment and intellect and all of these different thought processes, and then it's down in the limbic system that we have our feelings and our emotions, and then that's where a lot of the automatic responses are processed through. Right. Now, thinking is what you and I do most. We do more thinking than we do breathing. Question in the back. Isn't that the proteins are reacting to the environment and not the genes?
Yeah.
Well,
The proteins react to the genes, but it's the environment that the proteins react to.
okay, all right. So is it the genes that the proteins react to, or is it the environment that the proteins react to? So the proteins are produced because of the genes. So the genes are the blueprint that are necessary for the production of the proteins. So the protein wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the genes. And if the gene is broken, so the blueprint is broken, then the protein that's going to be produced from that blueprint is going to be broken as well. And so it's part of what we talked about yesterday, an inheritance. So you can have an inherited problem or an inherited condition. And if that's the case, then you would expect to see it from little. And you would expect it to see it in every cell that uses that part of the broken blueprint, right, the broken DNA. Do the proteins react to the environment? Yes, absolutely. Chemistry reacts to the environment around it and is dependent upon the environment around it, for sure. You change the temperature, you change the pressure, you change the other types of chemicals that are involved in the system, and you start mixing that in, there will be a reaction associated with it. So yes, the proteins react to the environment around them, but it's the genes that determine which proteins are produced. And if the gene is correct, then it'll produce the correct protein. And if the gene for that protein is messed up, then it's going to produce a messed up protein. Right? But an individual that developed, let's say for instance, they develop depression when they're 15 or 17 or something like that, well, that's not inheritance, because you had somebody that was not depressed and was producing chemicals just fine before that point. If it's inheritance, it should come from when they're little, right? And you should notice it all the way through when they're little, right? So thinking is what we do the most. We do it more than breathing, and we're always thinking, but the question is, what are thoughts?
Given bound.
What's that?
Given bound.
Heaven bound. All right. All right. So that's what you're thinking on. That's good. But still, the question, what are thoughts? Right? Where do they come from? And where do they start? And wherever they start, that will be where you start. Because how much of, let me ask it this way, how much of what's around you is the result of thought? Well, yeah, I mean, somebody thought of the stairs, and somebody thought of the carpet, and somebody thought of the projector, and somebody thought of the beam, and somebody thought of the ceiling tiles, and somebody, and so on and so forth. And when we look outside and we see the grass and we see the tree and so on, that came from whose thought? God's thought. Right? It came from God's thought. And the fact that it's mowed or cut down is from somebody else's thought. So everything around you came as the result of thought. So how much of what happens in you is the result of thought? So what do thoughts do in you? Well, they do everything, right? They do everything, right, in us. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't chemistry and there aren't external factors and there aren't external reactions and so on. We're going to cover that a little bit more in just a few minutes. Yes, there are. But we need to consider the power and the impact of thoughts in relation to an individual or a creature that thinks. Right? So, question, can the brain think? Okay. All right, we've got a number of opinions, and it's split between yes and no. And when the teacher gets to grade the test, then we'll find out what you get back on the test, right? Now, the brain is composed of chemistry, right? Every part of the brain, you can get it and you can break it down. You can evaluate what atoms are there, what molecules are there, protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms, molecules, and so on. And very complex, but composed of chemistry. And chemical reactions are dependent upon outside factors to function, so environment, right? It's dependent upon environment. And chemical reactions can only function according to the laws that govern their function, right? They're dependent upon law, just like, everything else. And chemistry can absorb, can store, and share energy and information, right? So power can pass through matter. But information can as well. We talked about the letter yesterday, and love, and getting love, and having a love letter. Well, that was information that was put in a physical thing, in a physical form, sent via the New Zealand Post to your location, and then you were able to read that letter and extract the information. So information can be put into something that's physical, it can be transmitted by something that's physical, and it can be extracted from something that's physical. But I'll tell you, information never originates in the physical. Information never originates in the physical. Information is always the evidence of something spiritual. So chemistry can do all of this like your computer hardware. Right? You've got a hard drive, and it's the hard drive that stores the information that can then be accessed by the software in order to do things for it. And so the brain is the storage location for the information. And if you damage the hardware by putting a bullet through it, is it going to function properly? No. No, there's going to be dysfunction associated with it because now you have damaged the hardware, and now the software doesn't have the same information to be able to access because the hardware is messed up, right? So how many thoughts can the brain itself think by itself? Well, chemical elements cannot feel. Hydrogen, helium, lithium, boron, carbon, argon. You go through the periodic table of elements and whatever new ones that they found. Can any of them feel? No, of course not. Chemical elements cannot choose. Don't have the capacity to do so. They can't make decisions. Chemical elements cannot decide to destroy themselves. Chemical elements cannot have consciousness. They cannot have cognitive abilities. They cannot have morals. They can't realize something and then like it or not like it. And chemical elements cannot, you wanted that picture, sorry, I'll go back. There you go. You're welcome. And chemical elements cannot organize themselves. They cannot regulate themselves. They cannot act for themselves. They can react to what's done to it. And the chemical elements cannot look into a mirror and study themselves and know why things are the way they are. Right? Chemical elements don't have any of these capacities. And we might, if we looked at it from a scientific standpoint, and that's why we're looking at what science doesn't know, if you look at it from a scientific standpoint, well, the background assumption of science is evolution, and evolution, the background idea of evolution is materialism. So that is that matter is all there is, and that spirituality or anything that is, thoughts or other things like that are simply the effect of matter, a manifestation of matter that has come together to a certain degree by itself, has organized itself, has regulated itself, and has now become so complex that it can now produce thought, and now it can produce morality, and it can produce so on and so forth. And this is evolutionary theory. And I would argue with you that it's completely wrong. It's absolutely backwards. It's not the physical that generates the spiritual. It's the spiritual that generates the physical. Right? It was God who is spirit that spoke, and the physical came into existence. Right? And you and I are created in God's image. So in us, it's the spiritual that's the beginning, and it's that which controls the physical. Right? So humans are not like marionette dolls where somebody's pulling our strings and making us, forcing us to do this or that or the other thing. We can do all of the things that were described that chemicals cannot do. And a human can not only just react to what happens, although we can, but we can act for ourselves. Right? We can make our own choices, our own decisions. And where do those abilities come from if it's not an ability of chemistry? All right, well, what needs do we have? Do you need love? Yeah. Do you need truth? Yeah. Or do you need somebody to lie to you? No. Doesn't go over well, right? Do you need justice? Or do you like to be treated unjust? Yeah. Do you need compassion? Or do you want people to be hateful towards you? No. Do you need harmony? Yeah. Or do you need conflict? Yeah, no. Do you need security? Or do you need to be insecure? Right? All of those are spiritual needs. They're not physical needs. There is nothing physical that needs justice. Right? There's no atom, proton, neutron, electron that needs some kind of justice in relation to anything. So, yes, we need harmony and security and compassion and truth and justice and love and all of these different things. And yes, there is a law that governs those. And the great thing about the spiritual needs is that there is no upper limit. You can have too little, and with too little you might end up with symptoms and disease and even death, and it's going to be uncomfortable and you're not going to function well, but there's never too much. You can never have too much love. You can never have too much justice. You can never have too much truth, right? Now, sometimes the truth is painful and it needs to be dosed out in a little bit, but, a truth about ourselves. But we need it, and you need it. There's no upper limit to it. Right? Now, you and I, we feel hunger, we feel thirst, we feel fatigued, and if it's too cold, chills, and if it's too hot, hot, and suffocation, and so on. All of those are various different physical symptoms that you and I understand, and they tell us that the body lacks something. Right? The body lacks water, the body lacks food, the body lacks warmth, the body lacks oxygen, and so on. And this is like the gas gauge on the vehicle. Right? The gas gauge on the vehicle is to let you know what the needs of the vehicle are. Why does the vehicle have a gas gauge? If the vehicle had the capacity to fuel itself, would there be a need for a gas gauge? No. Because when it was getting low, it could go and plug in and fulfill its need. The gas gauge is not for the vehicle. The gas gauge is for the driver of the vehicle. Right? It's for the driver of the vehicle. So, to whom does the body signal its need? Right? So, the symptoms prove that the body cannot provide for its own needs. So, there has to be something that controls the body. There has to be something that supplies the needs for the body, like there is a driver for the car. And a physical thing can only take in or absorb what it needs if it's brought close to it. If the oxygen is outside of this room, well, sorry, you're not going to continue to live as you try to breathe no air, right? Or whatever, if they filled it with helium, we'd all have really high voices for a little while and then we'd all be dead. Because we can't live on helium, we must live on oxygen. So if you need it to live by, it must be brought close to you in order for you to absorb it. And there's certain places where you need to absorb it. You're in contact with air with your skin all the time, but it's not enough in order for you to supply your air needs. You've got to get it into the lungs so that you get it into the alveoli and all that large surface areas, and only a cell between your oxygen and the blood vessels, so that you can get that oxygen into the bloodstream and have enough of it to be able to function. Right? So physical things cannot go in search of and find what they need in order to bring it to themselves. Like a tree. It's a physical thing. It's alive. It can't go in search for what it needs. Right? If the soil runs out, it can't pluck up its roots and then go to find another soil in order to go there. Yes, it grows, and there are chemical reactions that cause it to grow in particular directions and so on. But in man, there's something that receives the symptoms, that recognizes what is needed, that goes in search for what's needed, and then brings it close to the body so that the body can absorb it. In other words, there's something that causes you to go find it and drink it, eat it, breathe it, and so on. And again, you have spiritual needs, a bunch of them, but there's no molecule and no combination of molecules that need a spiritual need. All of those are physical, right? And I mean, those are spiritual needs, but the chemicals are physical. So spiritual needs reveal the presence of a spiritual entity. And we talked about it last night. What spiritual entity do you have? You have a spirit, right? Genesis 2:7. God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Right? And the soul is made up of two components. Breath, which is very simple, but becomes a very complex spirit, and dust, which is very simple, but becomes a very complex body. And you are a combination of body and spirit. And the combination of the two is the soul. It's you. Right? And you must have both in order to live. You must have both in order to think. You must have both in order to be a living being as you are. Right? That's how God created us to be. And so you don't just have a body, you also have a spirit. Right? And yes, you need all of these physical needs, and you need oxygen, water, food, and warmth, you do not need suffocation, dehydration, starvation, freezing, and burning. And you need love and acceptance, respect, honor, truth, justice, mercy, and compassion. You do not need selfishness, rejection, disrespect, dishonor, lies, injustice, cruelty, and indifference. You don't need those things. So everything that you need is good. Every need that you have is a good need. And when it's supplied, it allows you to function the way that you're supposed to function. Is it a good thing that everything that you need is good? Yeah. And what does it tell you about where you came from? He's good. Right? He's good. Because every need he created you with is a good need. It's a good need. So God only created you with with a need that was good, right? And he never created you with a need for what is bad. And you can only pursue what you need, which is good. You cannot pursue what goes against your needs, which is bad. And somebody's, the red flag's about to go fly. Unless you're deceived into believing that you need it. Right? It's only in the context of a delusion, it's only in the context of a deception that you can avoid what you need and pursue what you do not need. But you only do so thinking that what you need, you don't need, and that what you don't need, you need. It's the only way that it happens. It's in that context of delusions. Or you are forced in a circumstance or a situation where you must either renounce this need or that need, and you're going to give up the lesser need for the greater one. Right? Because you're never going to give up the greatest need. You won't. You can't. But you'll give up a lesser need in order to retain or to hold on to a greater need. So, physical needs fulfill your life, but spiritual needs fulfill your purpose. Right? Physical needs are for life, spiritual needs are for purpose. And if there's a conflict between the spiritual needs and the physical needs, well then who is it that's going to win? Which one's going to win? Yeah, the spiritual needs are going to win. So who's this guy? Yeah, Mahatma Gandhi. And what is he doing? He's fasting. Right? Does he have a need for food? Yes. But what else does he have a need for? I heard it. Justice. He has a need for justice. And his need for justice is greater than his need for food. And so he will let go of his lesser physical need for the sake of obtaining the greater spiritual need. Have you ever heard of individuals that had done that to the point of death? Yeah. You can deny life even, but you cannot deny purpose. Well, you can be confused into thinking what it is or thinking that you've lost it, but you can't voluntarily give it up. Right? So a proof that we are more than matter is the fact that we can renounce the most important physical aspect, and that is life. Right? We can renounce life. And so our spiritual needs are always more important and always come before our physical needs. And we can renounce life in suicide. We can renounce life in martyrdom. We can renounce life in some form of sacrifice. But we can never, on purpose, give up purpose. But we can come to the point of believing that we have lost purpose. And when you've lost purpose, you lost your reason to live. And everything that gives purpose is spiritual, not physical. It's not the physical that gives purpose, it's spiritual. You don't find purpose in food. Food is only a means. So, what's the difference between a dead person and a living person? Yeah. So here's a dead person, no electricity. And there you have a living person, and there's electricity. And that, of course, is the top of the brain, the cortex of the brain, where the electricity is at. All right, so the difference is that, but where does the electricity come from? Right. What causes the difference? You know, you take somebody that's a second before they die versus a second after they die. What's the difference? It still has all the chemicals. Right. Yeah. So there was something that left, something that's separated. So you have a spirit. And as long as the spirit is together with the body, then you can generate the electrical activity that keeps an individual alive and keeps the system running. And you do have those components of body and spirit, and the combination of the two is the soul. And a major part of the soul is the mind. I'm not saying that the soul is only the mind. You are the soul. But the mind is a major component of that, right? And if you have the spirit and the spirit separates from the body, what happens? Well, you end up with a dead body and a dead spirit. Because it only functions when it's together. It doesn't function when it's separate, right? Like hardware and software in a computer. And how do these parts or how do these units work together? Well, you have needs from the body, and those are signaled through the nervous system, from the nerves, from the organ, or whatever it is, and that signal is being sent up to the cortex of the brain, and that is then received by the mind, right? And that information is then going to be evaluated. Then you are going to make some decision in relation to that. And the decision is either going to be, yes, I'm going to fulfill that need, or no, I'm not going to fulfill that need. And then that will be sent back down to the body. So the information that's sent by the body up to the mind or the spirit is a request, because it's the spirit that decides, or the mind that decides, whether you're going to give in to that or not. Right? But when the spirit or the mind sends the information to the body, that's not a request, that's a command. The body can't just decide, no, I'm not going to do that. If the mind gives the command to the muscle, move, the muscle's got to move, unless there's no connection between the mind and the muscle, or the muscle doesn't have the fuel to be able to do it. As long as there's the fuel, and as long as there's a connection, when the mind says move, the muscle's going to move. Right? But when the body says, I'm hungry, I want to eat, the mind can say, no, now's not the time. Right? So these physical symptoms of hunger and thirst and so on, those are sent by the body to the spirit, so the spirit can look for and supply what the body needs. And because the body can't do it itself, just like the car can't fuel itself, and it's the spirit that makes the body move, that searches for the physical things that we need, and makes the body bring those things in, so to breathe and to drink and to eat and so on and so forth. Or stops the body from doing that by fasting or holding your breath or whatever it is. Right? And what can act and what can react? Well, we know that the body can react because it's made of chemistry. And the body, which is made of chemistry, always reacts to outside forces or information. Right? It can be controlled from outside, it can be damaged from outside, and it is always governed from outside. But the spirit is different. The spirit can react like the body, but it can act for itself. Right? The mind can act for itself. And it is internally self-governing. The mind was not created to be controlled by someone or something else. Your mind was created to be controlled by you. And you have your own self-government. Therefore, you have your own thoughts, you have your own beliefs, you have your own choices, your own decisions, your own actions, and those are nobody else's, even God's, even His. Because He created you with that capacity, He's not going to take back that capacity. Because He did so, He created you with it rightfully. Right? He created you with it rightfully. And so the mind can never be forced, although we can try to force it. And the mind can never be harmed from outside. Now the brain can. You can put a bullet through the brain, and it can be damaged from the outside. But the spirit part of the mind can never be forced from the outside. It can only control itself from the inside. Right? Tracking along so far? All right. Just want to make sure I'm not going too fast. It's easy for me because I've been over this ground a long time, you know, and sometimes it's hard for me to remember what it was like, you know, coming to this information for the first time and going, oh man. All right, so who can see? Who is it that sees? Or what in you sees? Well, you have eyes, and the eyes are where? In the spirit or in the body? They're in the body, right? So you have eyes that are in the body, and that information is sent up to the cortex. And you have ears that are in the body, and that information is sent up to the cortex. And you have a nose, and you have tongue, and you have skin, and so on. And all that information is sent up to the cortex. And it's there where you receive that information. Now you evaluate that information, and then you determine what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you taste, and what you feel. So that is something that's determined in the mind. And you can have an individual that has completely intact functional eyes, with a completely intact functional retina, with a completely intact functional optic nerve, and so on. And you can have them with a functional cortex, optic cortex in the back of the brain, and so on. And you can have somebody that has all of those functional components, and yet they still can't see. They can still be blind, even though they have all the components, all the functional, you know, all of those components are functional and well. Now, what's the spirit or the mind going to do? It's now going to make a decision of how it reacts to or how it relates to what it sees, hears, smells, and tastes and feels, and that decision is going to be sent back down to the body as a command. And the body will respond. So the body receives and transmits physical information from the environment around it, and then it's the mind or the spirit that interprets that sees, hears, smells, tastes, and feels, and then determines how to respond. So this is how they work together in combination. Right? But only together, never separate. So without a spirit, excuse me, there is no consciousness, there are no thoughts, there are no spiritual needs, no judgment, no morality, no responsibility, no spirituality or ideologies, there are no sensory perceptions, no education, teaching, or learning. Today's opportunities would be pointless. There's no voluntary bodily movements. Right? Without a spirit, there is none of that. So all of that is, you must have a spirit in order for those things to happen. And then you might think about it and you say, well, what about animals? Well, yes, animals have spirits too. They do. And the Bible refers to that. It talks about the spirits of man, you know, when he dies going up, and the spirit of the animal going down. However you interpret that, animals do have spirits too. So, do you need love? Yeah, maybe? Okay, yes? All right, what's the definition of a need? All right, so it's, can you live without a need? No, that's what is the difference between a need and a want. It might be things that you want, but you can live without them. A need, you can't live without it. So it must be something that you need in order to survive, but also something that you cannot produce. Because if you could produce the oxygen that you need to live by, well, then there's no need to get it. Right? You don't have a need of it because you can produce it. The reason that you have 8 or so essential amino acids that you need is because you can't produce those amino acids, but you can produce all of the other ones, and so those aren't those aren't needed because you can produce those other ones, right, from other foods that you eat. So, can you produce love? No, no. And is that just our problem, or is that everybody's problem? Yeah, it's everybody's problem, right? So none of us can produce love, but every one of us needs love. And of course, then the question is, well, what kind of love do we need? Right? What kind of love do we need? Do we need a love that's full or incomplete? Do we need a love that's constant or intermittent? Do we need a love that is unselfish or selfish? Do we need a love that's personal or impersonal? No. We need a love that's full and constant and unselfish and personal. That's the kind of love that we need. Now, do you need a respect that respects you partially or completely? Some of the time or all of the time? So that it can get something from you or so that it can give to you? Give to you. And because it has to or because it wants to? Yeah, so you need a respect that respects you completely, constantly, for your sake, because it wants to. Right? And do you need an understanding that understands you partially or completely? Do you need an understanding that understands you some of the time or all of the time? Yeah, all of the time. For itself or for you? For you. And because it has to or because it wants to? Because it wants to. So everybody needs an understanding that understands them completely, constantly, for their sake, voluntarily. And that is the case. We can go through every single need that you have, and it's true for every single need that you have. Every need that you have, you need it completely. You need it constantly. You need it willingly. You need it unselfishly. That's how you need it, right? For anything that you need. Partial will never work, intermittent will never work, forced will never work, ulterior motives will never work. That's not what you need. Right? So, you need it completely, constantly, willingly, and selflessly. That's what you need. And so, who or what is the source of the love, the respect, and the understanding, and every other spiritual need that you have that you need completely, constantly, voluntarily, and unselfishly? It cannot be another human being. Can't be. Because every human needs that. And if you need it, you can't be the source of it. Right? So it cannot be multiple other human beings. Because as we talked about last night, you take every tree and uproot it and put its roots in another tree, and every tree has its roots in other trees. What's going to happen to all the trees? They're all going to die. And if you do that with people and you put people's roots in every other person, and I don't care how many people it is, if everybody's got their roots in everybody else, we're all going to die because we're not the source of the love that we need. So it must be, the source must be something that is full of love, full of respect, full of understanding, that constantly, voluntarily, and unselfishly offers those things to you for your sake. That's what the source must be. And that source is God. And I picture God as a circle because he's complete in and of himself. Right? And he doesn't need anything outside of himself. He's the source of everything. And he is truly independent. He can function without having to have anything else to need in order to function with. Right? He is complete in and of himself. His creation, however, is not complete. And so we function as channels, and each channel taking to give, taking to give, taking to give, taking to give, and eventually coming back to God, who is the source of all. And it must be that if everything in creation takes in order to give, there must be a source where you take from. There has to be an origin for the circuit, because everything functions in a circuit. And the fact that we have the needs that we do proves the existence of God and what he's like. He must be love. He must be understanding. He must be honor. He must be respect. He must be justice. He must be mercy. He must be everything that we need. Otherwise, we die. Right? Otherwise, we die. All right, that's another part for another part. I think time has excused us from going on at the moment. So I will pray, and then you can announce what happens in regards to break and then moving on to the next part of the service. But let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you that you are God and that you are everything that we need. And that, oh, Lord, you are exactly what we're looking for. And I know many of us have had a problem understanding that because we thought you were like our parents. We thought you were like our perpetrators. We thought that you were like people around us. But you're not. So, Lord, open our eyes and help us to see and understand who you truly are and what you're like. And may we come to you as our source, and may our roots be planted in you rather than other people. And Lord, show us what that will be like, what that will look like, and how beautiful that is. And Lord, thank you that now, well, we can know more than what science will know, and that is that we have a spirit, and we have spiritual needs, and you are the source of what we need. And this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.